What's up, guys? In this video, we're going to be talking about the thin wrapper API functions for processing XML data within the maci library. Now, to give credit where credit is due, the thin API functions for XML are actually using two different libraries. One for dealing with dictionaries, which is probably the easiest, and the other one dealing with element or element tree objects. And so the thin API functions used for the maci library that enable XML functionality utilize and wrap the native xml.etree library, which is shipped with the Python standard library, and the XML to dict external library for its underlying functionality. Now, another thing I want to call out before we get started is that it's important to evaluate handling XML data carefully, as there are known vulnerabilities in dealing with XML data. I definitely recommend checking out the official Python documentation talking about this, as they do unpack some of the XML exploits. Now, there is additional tooling which maci actually does provide, which I'll talk about later in this video, to help and aid in prevention from experiencing some of those exploits. However, it is not guaranteed. The maci library is not guaranteeing or assuring full protection in any manner. With that said, I'm not trying to scare you. XML is obviously a widely adopted language and used everywhere, but I just want to make note that nothing is 100% secure in the world. In fact, it's impossible, but we do the best we can to keep things safe. Alright, with all that said, let's go ahead and dive into the XML functions. And there's quite a few, and that's because we're using two different libraries like mentioned earlier. The first one we're going to dig into is the dictionary side of the XML functions, which makes it pretty easy to use and straightforward to load and dump data. So I have our sample XML file here, which has some of the example data that we've been using throughout the series for our example game. So let's go ahead and load this file data and see how to access it. So we'll write out maci, type XML, and as per usual, if you type some of the other third-party libraries, you'll see all the related functions associated with them right here. The first one we're going to check out is load dict. Let's go ahead and create a variable like we normally do for our file name, and we'll just call it mygame.xml, and we'll go ahead and pass that in. So we hover over this. The only required parameter is the file name, which also accepts a path object. If you're not sure what a path object is, please look up the pathlib library from Python's official documentation for more information. Now, as you can see, this actually returns an ordered dictionary, which is pretty much just a dictionary. If you're not sure what an ordered dictionary is, you can look it up and find out more about it. But in short, it basically returns your data as a normal dictionary, but all the data is structured in the order it was received, which is typically useful when you're reading your file from top down. You would kind of expect your data to be loaded from top down as well. So let's go ahead and run this and see what it returns. Get our trusty print function and run this. And as you see in the terminal, there's our data represented in a dictionary. So if I try to access the root key, or which is the root element of an XML document, we should get the data that's associated with the root. And then if I wanted to access the username, we should simply be able to type username, and there's our value. And that's it. That's how simple it is to load your data from an XML file and access your data like you normally would in a dictionary. Now, if you're not familiar with root and sub elements within an XML file, I'm not going to go over it, but I did mention root. The root is the first level that's always inside of an XML document. And then beneath that, you have your sub elements. So here's your root element and then your sub elements. Again, I'm not going to be explaining XML to you. Definitely watch some videos or look in the documentation how to understand it. Next, I'll go ahead and show you how to load XML data from a string and return it as a dictionary. So I've gone ahead and created a basic multi-line string with some XML data written inside of it. And now we're going to go ahead and load that and have it parse, and it should return a dictionary. So in order to do that, all I need to simply do is access the load string dict. And as mentioned before in previous videos, you're probably used to something showing load s, but with maci, it's going to use str just to make it more explicitly understood. This is also useful for those who are kind of new to this space, just to make it more understandable. Now, if I hover over this, we're going to see all it accepts is our string data formatted in XML. So let me go ahead and pass that in. And so just like we saw with load dict, we should get the same result, but of course it's loading it from a string. So if I run this, there's our data. And again, I should be able to access it as you'd expect using the dictionary structure. So I tried to access username, and there's our value after we ran it, Johnny88. And again, it's returning an ordered dictionary, but don't worry about that so much. If you do want to look into it, again, look into the Python documentation about ordered dictionaries. So now that we know how to load XML data into a dictionary, let's see how to write data from a dictionary. Now, something else I want to mention, as you probably noticed with the dictionary data there, all of our values get converted to strings. And so just keep that in mind. Any kind of XML data that's loaded in, the values will always be a string. Of course, you can write some logic to try and convert it to its correct data type, but I'm not going to demonstrate that in this video. So now let's see how to dump our data from a dictionary to an XML file. I've gone ahead and created a sample dictionary using the same example data that we've been using throughout the series, at least some of it. And we're going to go ahead and create a new file called mygame2.xml. So if we write this out, we're just going to type maci.xml dump dict. Now, if we hover over this, you see there are a few options, but the two required parameters, which is consistent with other functions as well, is the file name and the data. And you see the data accepts a dictionary in order to write to the file. And of course, we have the file name, which accepts a string or a path. If you don't know what a path object is, as mentioned before, please look up the pathlib library on Python's official documentation site. So let's go ahead and pass in our file name, just called file name, and then our dictionary data. And this shouldn't return anything because it's creating a file. Now, before I run this, there's something I want to make note, and that's the structure of the dictionary. In any properly formatted XML file, you always need a root element, and the root element in this example is just the first key. So you only need one key at the root of the dictionary, and then after that, you can create as many sub-element keys as you'd like, and even create even more nested structures if you want to. But you must always have only one key at the root of your main dictionary, and then you can create any sub-dictionaries as you'd like, at least for this function. So let's go ahead and run it. And so as you can see, it created a brand new file. We'll go ahead and drag it over, and there's our names and values like we'd normally expect. Of course, I can come in here and add a new one. Let's do like new data. And then we'll just do something like data and go ahead and run that. And you see there's our new sub element called new data with our data inside. That's pretty much all you need to do in order to write XML data to a file using a Python dictionary. And let's go ahead and take a look at some of the other options. So if we hover over this, we do see that there's three more options we definitely want to look into. You probably already know what append is by now, but we'll go ahead and run it just to show it. So if you want to append to your XML file, just go ahead and enable the append feature. So if I run that, you'll see now our data is going to be appended. Now this is actually an improper XML document at this point because now it's writing a second root element inside of this XML file. But who knows if you need to append maybe a half-written XML file. It just really depends on your situation, but the feature is there. So the other option is pretty. Now that's on by default, and if you can guess what that is, that's simply just adding indentation. And this pretty parameter is actually exposing the underlying functionality from this library, from XML to dict, which offers that ability to provide indentation. I highly recommend leaving it on, especially with XML docs, because they can get pretty messy or pretty hard to distinguish without indentation. But if you do disable it, and rerun this, it'll just put everything in the same line, and it'll be pretty hard to distinguish. I think the only exception is if you say had a new line character inside of your data, I think it's going to write it over multiple lines, and it does. And this is still valid XML because it has the special tags. As you can see, that could be very confusing and hard to distinguish. Better just to leave it on so you can easily discern the data. So let's check out the next option, which is full doc. Full doc is on by default because it's typically industry best practice to include your XML declaration at the top of your file. But if you don't want your XML declaration, you can go ahead and disable that. And if you run it, it will no longer be present. And this is still a valid XML file. If you load this data back in using the load function, let's just give an example. maci.xml load dictionary, and we'll specify our file name that we're using. So if you run this, go ahead and print it out, and you see it still loads the dictionary as you would expect. So that's how you write data from a Python dictionary to a file. So let's go ahead and see how to write it to a string. So in order to write your Python dictionary data to a string, we simply just need to add str. And like mentioned with load str, you're probably used to dump s instead of str, but str was created just to make it more explicitly understood, especially for those who might be new to this space. But if we hover over this function, all we need to do is pass our dictionary data. So let me go ahead and remove this file name. And let me go ahead and get our print function to see what it returns. So let's go ahead and check it out. And there it is. There's our XML data inside of a string being printed to the terminal, just like we saw in the file. And just like with just the dump to the file, you can disable pretty or full doc. So pretty again is for the indentation. So if we disable that, we should just get one long looking string, which I don't want personally. Going back to that. And if we disable the full doc, that's just going to redact the XML declaration, which is this guy right here. Go ahead and run that. But again, as mentioned before, with dumping to a file, it's typically best industry practice to leave your XML declaration, as that's part of the normal standard. So as far as handling XML through dictionaries, that's going to go ahead and conclude this part of the video and explaining and walking you through it. The next part is learning how to do this with the element tree objects. Now we went through the dictionaries first because that's the easiest and more universally understood objects that people can work with right off the bat. But Python also has other XML objects that you can work with, and one of the most popular ones is the element tree object. Now this part of the video is not going to talk to you or walk through with you how to use and operate an element tree object, but I'm simply going to show you how to use the maci thin API functions to load and write with element tree objects, and even how to simply view the data. Beyond that, if you want to learn more about element tree objects, please visit the official Python documentation site in order to learn about xml.etree element tree objects, or watch some videos online to learn more about them. So let's go ahead and load our XML data into an element tree object. We're still working with the same data as we've been working with so far, but this time it's just going to be a different object it gets loaded into. So let's type maci.xml load and hover over this. And so as you can see, all we need to specify is our file name or path object. If you're not familiar with what a path object is, please look up the pathlib library from Python's official documentation to understand them more. But we're just going to use our string as normal. And as you can see, it returns an element or element tree object. So let me go ahead and assign a variable to this. We'll call it etree data and pass in our file name. Now, something you might be questioning or wondering is why is the XML load doesn't have an etree name versus the dictionary, which has a dictionary name. Whereas before it said XML load dict, and this one just says XML load. This has to do with the porting over of the original API names from the original library. With that said, let's go ahead and load our data and take a look at it. So I'm going to get our print function, we're going to get our etree data, and if I run this is going to show you here's our element called myGame, which is the root name for our element etree object. Now, just to quickly show you how to access the data, you could do something like .find, and then we'll specify one of the key names, which is username, and then we'll ask for the text of that. So if I run that, there's our Johnny88. And like I said earlier, in the dictionary section, all of our values will always be returned as a string, no matter what. Anyways, let's go ahead and check out that other option that we saw under XML load, which is auto get root. Now, I'm not going to explain this in too much depth, but the auto get root parameter or option automatically collects the root element for you, so you don't have to and work with it as you would. When working with element tree objects, you usually want to collect the root from the beginning, but that also depends on what you're doing. But either way, just to keep it straightforward and easy, this feature is handled automatically for you. If you do not want that, you can go ahead and disable it. I'll go ahead and disable it and give you a comparison. So if we go ahead and disable it and run the code as is, everything is going to appear to work as normal, and that's fine. However, the thing that has changed is it's not focusing on the root element anymore. Now it's showing you the entire element tree. So if you run this, you see our object now says xml.etree.elementtree.elementtree object, right? Whereas when it's enabled to auto collect the root by default and run this, now you see it's actually showing us the element, which is root, which is our main element with all of our sub elements. Hopefully that makes sense if you're already familiar with working with the element tree objects. All right, so let's go ahead and see how to load our XML data now, but with a string. So as you can see, I have our example XML data simply thrown into a Python multi-line string. And we're going to go ahead and load that data and have it parsed from the string to return our XML data as an element tree object. So I'm going to type maci.xml load stir, and then we'll pass in our string data. As you can see, if we hover over this, the only required parameter is the XML string data, and it returns an element. So if I run this, we should see our root element, my game, and again, as demonstrated before with the file, if I want to get our data, find, we'll do money again, and we'll just grab the text. So if I run that, there's our value, and remember, the values is always going to be a string. Next, let's go ahead and see how to write our element tree object into a file and a string. Now, before I show you how to write your element tree objects to a file and a string, first I want to talk about building an element tree object. Now, I'm not going to go into depth with it at all, but I am going to reveal that maci's XML functions does come with an XML build manual function, which allows you to build your XML data manually using the element tree objects. And just like with the ini videos or the ini video, the object that's returned is a true element tree object from the official Python standard library. So in order to start building out data using an element tree object, we simply just need to do this, maci.xml build manual. And if you hover over this, there's no parameters because all it simply returns is an empty XML element tree module object to manually start building your XML etree data. So I'm going to go ahead and assign this to a variable called et, and then we'll go ahead and print this out so you can see what it looks like. So there it is, the xml.etree.elementtree module object. Please look up the Python official documentation to learn more about these, or please watch some videos online to learn about them, because again, I'm not going to go in depth on how to build them out, but I will show some example data on what it looks like to build out an element tree object. Alright, so I've gone ahead and set up a basic element tree object and built it out using some of the names and values we've been using thus far. And the first thing we'll show is how to store your element tree object to a file. So we'll go ahead and write out maci.xml dump. And if we hover over this function, we see that just like the other dump functions, we just accept our file name parameter and our data. And in this example, it needs an element tree or an element. So if we go ahead and pass that in, our file name, and then our tree, then that should store our data to the file that we've just created. And this should also create a new file called mygame2.xml. So when we run this, we see it ran successfully. We'll go ahead and drag this over, and we see there's our names and values stored inside the file. Now you probably noticed that our XML data is being stored in line. Maybe in the future that'll change, but for now, that's where it's at. Now the last thing I want to show you is the parameter options for this, which is just append and encoding. Again, I'm not going to show what encoding is. If you already know what it is, you should know how to handle it. The only real option you might be interested in is append, if you want to append more data to a file. So if I enable that, let's go ahead and bring our file out here. And also change this file name here real quick to our variable and run that. You'll see you got a second line of our XML data written to our XML file. Again, like mentioned earlier, this is actually improper XML syntax because now that's showing two different roots. However, if you do have a case where you need to append additional XML data to a file, that feature is available to you. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and see how to dump our element tree object to a string. So now all we need to do to dump our element tree object to a string is simply change this to str at the end. You're probably used to seeing dump s typically, but Maci switches to using str just to make it more explicitly understood, especially for those who are probably new to this space. But if we hover over this, all we need to do is just pass in our data, and let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see, it actually threw an exception because I forgot that this only accepts elements only and not the whole element tree object. So if we actually change this to the root and run this, we should get our data. And there it is. Now you see it's all XML data in a single line like we saw in the file, but nonetheless, there's our data. So we've pretty much shown all the main functionality you need to be aware of when handling and dealing with XML using the maci library. But there is one last thing I want to show you and talk about, which is more about security. As mentioned earlier, there is a useful function that can aid or help in support in mitigating some of the exploits when handling and processing XML data. But again, maci does not guarantee full protection. This is just a helpful aid or support. In fact, this function actually comes from a third party. So there's a special private function called diffuse XML standard library. And this function actually updates some of the standard library functionality dealing with XML and tries to incorporate some security mechanisms to deal and handle cases where your XML data might be exploited. Now, I'm not going to go into the deepness of this, but I would look into the diffused XML library and their official documentation talking about this. But just for your added support, maci went ahead and provided this as a useful extra function so you don't have to worry about getting into it. In order to use these mechanisms to help aid in mitigating some of those risk factors, all you need to do is just write maci._diffuse XML standard library. And that's it. You run this before you use any of the XML functionality in your code, usually best at the top of your file or at the beginning of your program before any XML functionality is used, and then you should be good to go. Now I want to warn you, this feature is experimental according to the actual developers. Please visit their documentation for more information and understanding using this external package, and even the official Python docs supporting diffused XML. Yes, Python themselves actually support this third-party package as an alternative option to help mitigate some of the XML risk factors. So even they suggest using this library under the hood in order to reduce some of those issues. Now you only need to call this once during the runtime of the program, and again it's best to call it at the beginning before you handle any XML data. But again, once it's ran, it's just essentially a patch to replace parts of the standard XML parsing libraries like the element etree, DOM mini-DOM, and the .sax, and even others with safer implementations that prevent some of the vulnerabilities out there. But that's going to go ahead and wrap up this video on processing XML data within the maci library. Thank you for watching. Take care.